Art is a language. It's a visual language. Art is communication. Art is entertainment. Art is educational and informative. Art is therapy, and art is therapeutic. Art does not need to be difficult to learn, and art is not only for those quote-unquote born with talent. And for those in doubt, there is no subject that's been exhausted by already having been. Any idea, any concept, any message has the potential to be explained a million different ways. My goal and hope is that this show will help all of you to understand these points and offer solutions for learning, building that ideal portfolio, advancing your skills, or level up to that next great plateau of understanding and performance. And I would also like to share with you many amazing artists who speak clearly and boldly in the work they do and push the boundaries of our craft. This show is catered to all forms of 2D and 3D art, and I hope all of you will find something beneficial in each episode that could help you on your way on your personal artistic journey. Thank you all for stopping by. Now let's get into the studio and level up.
Hello there, I'm Ron Lemon, and this is Level Up with Lemonade, Episode 6, the no-tan stage of rendering. The no-tan stage is basically building the surfaces of objects and then attributing a light source to those surfaces and gauging the range of contrast based upon that light source. It's the first part of what you do when you build a render. Now, so many videos just teach you a technique for painting a picture, but we're going to learn the science behind all of those techniques, how the artist sees and is able to build the picture that they build. In order to do that, though, you need to be able to measure what you're looking at, and that's what no-tan is. It's the science of measuring light against dark or light against shadow, two different types, and we use both in any realistic picture. The first is all about surfaces, the second is about the light source. And both of those are in step order, so that's what we're going to look at today in this video. I'm going to do a few demonstrations with the figure, but I'm also going to work with other subject matter as well, so that you can see this applies to anything and everything out there, including an invented image, so that you understand that it's not just something you need to look at, it's actually something that you can control from your imagination. All right, we have a lot to cover in this video. I don't want to keep you here in this intro for too much longer, so let's go ahead and move on into the information, and thank you again for watching. I'll see you soon.
So what is local color? And what is local value? What are those terms? They are one and the same. Local color is in a color state, while local value is the value of that color. So they both share the same information, only one is in grayscale and the other one is in color, but both share the exact same information. These are all objects lit by a powerful spotlight, and it makes it sometimes difficult to measure the value of the object because the light could be so bright. The way that we want to measure each color is by comparing each of them to each other one at a time. Which one is lightest? Which one is darkest? How much lighter is the lightest from the darkest? How much darker is the darkest from the lightest? And then all the other ones in between, are they closer to the darkest or are they closest to the lightest? And that gives us some approximation for how to measure. But realistically speaking, we would like to be able to measure it this way, where there's a flatness to the light, no shadows being cast, no overbearing light source that dominates over everything else, although it is dominating the green apple at this point because of the shininess of the apple. But all the other objects we can see in a relatively flat space, which helps us measure the value of each of those objects. The value of each of these objects would be this. We're now looking at all those colorful objects in grayscale. These colors are these values. Now that green apple is definitely not lighter than the potato, but it is blown out right now because of the light source hitting it. It's a little overpowered. But in comparison, the potato is the lightest, then the green apple, then the carrot, then the wood of the speaker, then the pepper, then the apple, the red apple. And the backdrop is somewhere in between the green apple and the potato. And the mesh on the wooden object on the speaker is close to the same value as the apple. Close, because it is darker. Now, when we look at it this way, the wood and the mesh are relatively close together in the same value. And both of those are a little bit closer to the pepper than they are the dark apple. So they would all be grouped together into the same value range. The stem on the pepper is closer to the carrot than it is the potato or the green apple. Although if the green apple wasn't as blown out, I would say that the green apple also shares very similar value to the pepper stem in this picture. This is not a kind of condition that you will have most of the time. Most often, you'll have situations where the objects are distorted, much like this light source is doing. This light source is powerful enough that it creates hot highlights. It changes the temperature of the object on the lit side. And as a result, the shadow side is also shifting in temperature because of the indirect light. Indirect light is the room light, all the rest of the light that's in the room space. What I'll do here is shift the indirect light so it's something a little bit more like the blue sky outside. So now all of the shadows are filled with this blue light, which means that the indirect side is cooler while the direct lit side is warmer. And I'll push the warmth even further so that you can see that there is a difference in the ground plane now between the direct spotlight and the shadows. There's a shift and a distinction between the two of those. Most spaces will be like this, with an overhead set of lights that are very similar to fluorescent lights. So something a little bit more in this direction. Schools are lit this way, offices are lit this way, shopping centers are lit this way, or more specifically, supermarkets and places like Target and other convenience shopping centers. The overhead lighting cools off the space. It doesn't warm up the space. In fact, we don't have as many light sources that have warm conditions like a spotlight as we used to, because those bulbs, especially in the United States, have been banned. So we're using a lot of LED light, which is cooler. In this case, I have both the spotlight and the area light going at the same time. So you can see warmth on the front of these objects while the backs of them are cooled off. The shadow side is cooler. The direct light side is warmer. Turning this light off, we can see that more specifically here. We can see the difference in temperature between the two sides, as well as the difference in the lightness and the darkness. The mesh over here on the speaker shows it really clearly. We can see this side is warmer and this side is cooler. And this is how most light sources work. Or if you're outdoors, this is how the natural light works. You have the sun, which is a warm light, and then you have the sky, which is a cooler light. So wherever there's a shadow, it's being lit by the blue sky. Wherever you have an object facing towards the sun, it's being illuminated by the sun. So objects that are directly facing what you will call the primary light source are facing the sun, while the indirect light source is the blue sky filling in all of the shadows. So shadows aren't black. And the only way that a shadow could be dark in that instance is in a dark lit space with a spotlight on. So I'm going to go back here now and change this to a really dark value. And here you can see that most of the shadows are falling into darkness, into almost a black value. However, whatever objects are sitting near each other are bouncing color back into the shadows, so they aren't all black. Some of them are that aren't being influenced by any surface, and those that are not black at all. They're a lighter value. This is how we measure light, through the contrast of the lit side versus the shadow side. The more intense the shadow, the stronger the light. When the shadows are weaker, the light is not as strong. Or, in this case, because the light is covering up everything above, it's basically a rooftop of light, then there's no way for any shadow to appear very easily, especially when I turn off the spotlight. This is the room light, and the room light is the same size as the space where the objects are. So that means that light is coming at them in every direction, which reduces their shadows down to just barely underneath them. And those areas we would call occluded areas. Those are ambient occlusions. Those are areas where light can't actually drift in, but almost everywhere else, light is bouncing into those surfaces, onto every surface, because the light is spread across the space, kind of like the blue sky. The blue sky is everywhere above you. If the sun wasn't there, you would be ambient lit because of how much the size of the sky is versus how small you are in reference to it. It would be lighting you from every single direction. So again, local value and local color are the same thing. To measure them, we would want to be able to see them in an ideal condition. But if the conditions aren't ideal, then you would measure their lightness or darkness against the other things that surround them. And that is how you begin measuring local value. Local value is also local color. And in order to measure the value of the color, you have to squint your eyes to not see the color so distinctly, but pay attention to how light or dark objects are next to each other, and then referencing a value scale, like we can here. This is a value scale over here off to the left. This is how we would judge which one is lighter versus which one is darker. And then as an artist tool, we have a value scale that's divided into 10 distinct parts from white to black. And we use that as a limited range of value, but something that is usable, something that is measurable. This value scale has thousands of values. That's too many for us to even perceive. So we break it down into 10 easy steps, which have distance between each step so that there's a clear judgment of each value. We can read each one very distinctly because it's separated from the other ones just enough that we can measure with, just like a ruler. We're using the increments on a ruler to measure length. We're using the increments on a value scale to measure lightness and darkness. As I mentioned in the last segment, we measure the light by the intensity of the shadows. If the light is really strong like a spotlight, then we have high contrast. That means that the light source is really strong and the shadows are also going to be equally strong. We're going to see them very clearly, very distinctly. Now, if you notice, like with the carrot, the shadow isn't completely filled in dark. The ground over here is reflecting light back into the shadow, causing the shadow to have what is called reflected light in it. If I take that backdrop and I change the value to something darker, now you can see that the dark surface is absorbing most of the light source and causing all of the shadows, minus the ones that are near other objects, to go flat and black. The ones near other objects are being reflected in the local value, local color of each of these objects. So this carrot is bouncing into the pepper and to the apple. The apple is bouncing into the potato. And because this pepper is dark and shiny and this apple is dark and shiny, there is a little bit of local color in there, but not very much. It isn't pure black though, because we can still see an edge all the way around the apple. As I lighten the value of this a little bit, we start getting even more bounce light, and then bounce light into objects that weren't receiving bounce light before. If I take this all the way up to a pure white, Now we can see that all the shadows are filled in with some kind of light, but we can still tell, especially when the shadow drifts out farther from the other objects, because now out here there are no local values bouncing into it. We can tell just how strong the light source is, which means we know how dark to go with the shadows. If I take the light source and I reduce its strength, we can start to see that the lit areas aren't as strong as they used to be, and even within the shadows, they start to dim a little bit more. And then if we turn on another light source that washes out the spotlight, but is not as strong, we can still see shadows from the spotlight because it is the strongest light of the two. But the spotlight is no longer a dominant light. And this is like our blue sky. The blue sky kind of does this with the sun. Unless it's noon, where the sun is directly over the objects, that is where the light will be the strongest in terms of the darkest shadows. But as soon as it drifts from noon into the evening light, more and more sky will start to fill the shadows because the sun is getting weaker, because it's now not directly aimed at all the objects. It's askew to them, and atmosphere fills the rest of the space. And it also darkens the light source a little bit, or weakens the light source a little bit. The light has to travel through more atmosphere to actually illuminate objects, in which case the sky becomes a more dominant light source and fills the shadows like we see here. If I continue to weaken the sky, you can still see some blue within the shadows, but the spotlight starts to take over. And if we shut that skylight off altogether, then the only light source we have left is the direct light, which is now the strongest, projecting extremely strong shadows. And the only atmosphere that we get within the shadows are objects that are near one another, bouncing their local color into those shadow spaces. So we have to take in two light sources into consideration: the direct light as well as the indirect light. How strong is the indirect light? If you draw in art classes, most of those classrooms are still going to have the overhead lights on, even though there's a spotlight on the model, which means that the spotlight isn't going to be as strong as if you turned off the overhead lights. But then it would be difficult for the students to see what they're drawing, which is the reason why the overhead lights end up staying on. It's unfortunate because it doesn't give strength to the shadows, which doesn't give strength to the forms. Shadow helps us define form, with its shadows crossing a surface, and then the halftones coming from the shadow help reveal how rounded or how angular a surface is. In a drawing class, especially when you're first learning, you are reducing color down to value. And hopefully there's a strong spotlight on the subject matter so that you can see the forms easily and you can identify them based upon their roundness or flatness because of the way the shadows fall, not just onto the table or onto the surface, but over the forms. How do they transition over the form? And that's very revealing of form, which is why you start with drawing and not with painting, so that you can understand the idea of value, light, and shadow, which all realistic things are depicted through. Without light, we can't see the objects. So we need light on the object in order to be able to not just read its silhouette, but also its three dimensions, its form. And that's the importance of starting with drawing first, so that you can learn that all colors have values and all forms have transition to them in some way. Whatever their gradation is revealing how round or how angular an object is. So now that we have a better understanding of what local value, local color is, which in this case, local color we're not going to deal with as much as we're going to reveal the local value of the local color. But we also understand as well how light works. We're now going to go and try this out on subject matter to learn how to draw three-dimensionally. We'll begin with a landscape, we'll move into a still life, finish with some figures and an invented image, and that should give some assistance or guidance as to what to do with light, with shadow, and how to reveal form.
To start, we first need to understand something about how to see things. We know that we're looking at shapes. In this case, we're looking at triangular shapes, inverted triangles with the tree, with these trees, upright triangles, and with the landscape, quarter triangles, or part of a larger shape, but we're only seeing a small portion of it, and everything in this particular image is angular. So if we were to reference what we're looking at things like this, like this, like this, and like this. Lots of angles. Within the shapes, we can see shapes as well, like the snow patches are also softer triangles, but still triangular, or triangles intersecting triangles, as we can see right here. So we have a shape language. The next thing we need to identify, without looking at shadows, and in this particular image, because the sun is only up high, there are only small shadows in the picture, as I'm pointing out along in here, tracing over the shadow shapes, the few that we can see. And then within these bushes in the foreground, the undersides are in shadow. The light is coming down from above, causing the undersides that are turned away from the light source to darken. Now, color can be intimidating, but as an art school in its orderliness goes, the first thing that you do in an art school is you draw shapes. Then the next thing that you do is you identify values. You draw with a pencil, look at an object, create its outline, fill it with tone. That tone comes from the pencil, which means it is going to remain in a grayscale state. What you're doing is reducing the color to its value. Every color of every object has a value to it. In grayscale, we're learning to identify those values. With color, you have to understand several more properties, not just color and not just value, but also its temperature and its chroma, the intensity of its brightness or colorfulness, and its temperature, warm or cool. Is it a warm green? Is it a cool green? In the case of the greens that we see here, these are all warm greens, while the blue in the background is a cool blue leading up to a warm blue going into violet. And then the tops of the mountains are reds and oranges, which are of the warm side of the color wheel, so they automatically default to warm. Although the tree here is an orange, and this is a cool orange down in here because it is not lit by the sun. It's actually illuminated by the sky, so it has been cooled off, and there is a temperature difference between these two oranges. But this is color related. If we look at this image in grayscale, the temperature, the color, all of that goes away, but we still see the value of each object. Notice how the shadows have sort of disappeared into this image. Because they were faint in their transition, we don't have a definite cutoff point where we can see the brightness or darkness of something very clearly and easily, with the exception of those little shadows that I pointed out earlier at the peaks of the mountains. Those are the only places where the shadow shows true. And if we turn this off again for a moment, we can see that there is a fall off right along here between the shadow side and the light side. The other thing getting in the way, though, of being able to see a true shadow versus a true light source is the atmosphere that sits between us and the mountain. Because there's enough atmosphere in the sky, as we can see here, the shadows have been muted slightly. If there wasn't this atmosphere between us and the mountain in the background, we would have maybe a more identifiable boundary between the lit portions and the shaded portions. But it doesn't show very clearly when we look at this in grayscale because of the atmosphere. This is one of the particular rules of landscape painting, what you would call the 3 C's. Clarity, color, and contrast are the 3 C's. And as we look further into the distance, the 3 C's diminish, meaning that they reduce in their powerfulness. They go from very clear in the foreground, like the darks in these trees are very clear because they're closer to us. That mountain is loaded with trees, but they don't have the same kind of contrast because they're further away. Along the horizon line, there are trees, but even those trees are lighter than the ones we see in the foreground. So their contrast is diminishing as it goes away, as well as the clarity, because the trees on the mountains are hard to identify, where the trees in the foreground are very easy to see. Their color also diminishes. The things are much greener in the foreground, and the green fades as it goes back into space. And eventually that green turns to blue-green because of the atmosphere. That's what sits between us and the mountain, is atmosphere. That atmosphere might include pollution from the ground. It might be haze from the sky. It might also be fog, which comes from the clouds. So we have several different factors that can convolute those distances. Clarity, color, and contrast are reduced as they go away in space. As far as contrast goes, between the lighter objects in the foreground and the darker objects, we have this kind of contrast. But as they go back into space, especially down here on the ground plane, because I'm referring right now to these bushes over here, the local color starts to lighten a little bit. So let me darken this down just a tiny bit more. So there is a difference, but the shadow lightens a lot more. So the contrast point between the lightest portion and the darkest portion has been reduced by quite a lot as it goes back into space. And if we were to look at those same bushes on the hill back here, we can't tell the difference between the lit side and the shaded side at all. They're too far in the distance, and the shadows have been brought up in value by the atmosphere. So the difference between them then would be pretty much nothing. Maybe a hint of a contrast point, but not enough for us to really be able to see that shadow change where we could put that into our image. Also, if we did though, it would be quite a lot of noise that we would have to introduce into the background. So it's actually beneficial in the composition for all of that to have flattened into one big color value. It makes things easier to manage, but it also makes things less busy. So the foreground ends up becoming more of the focus than the background does. Although the background is competing pretty heavily because of the brightness of the colors back there. But that's for composition, and that's another discussion we're not going to get into right now. So clarity, color, and contrast reduce. What we're left with when we first start a picture is the graphic shapes within what you call the picture matrix. The picture matrix are these boundaries. The size of the photo is the picture matrix we are working with. In this picture matrix, we have the triangular shapes, the biggest one being here, a smaller one over here, one in the foreground over here. We could take this one and break it into its three parts, 1, 2, 3. And then the tree in the foreground we can identify by an inverted triangle, a slow curving triangle over here, another one back along here, a group of triangles here, and then a few individual as they move away from the bigger group. And I'm just going to get rid of this, and this, as well as this point up here now that it has been divided. There's also the larger triangle through here in the foreground with its boundary that runs down this way, splitting the north side from the south side, or however you want to label that, which I'll go ahead and do like so. And then over off to the side here, we have a few more triangles. There's another one, and this one is actually higher than it should be in the picture space. There's a small one here, and then the larger one here, and then one as it's rolling out of frame over off to the left. This triangle is actually more aligned here than over here. But I'm not drawing a tree as of yet. I'm still just pushing the triangles around until things start to match a little bit more clearly to the reference. In fact, the scale of the mountain to the scale of these trees needs to change. I'm going to take this part of the image and I'm going to reduce it down in scale to be a little bit more in line with what we see in the picture in terms of proportion to everything else. Something a little bit more like this. Then the tree that's in our foreground has additional triangles, and this is where things become a little bit more specific. There's a larger triangle through here, the trunk and the main branches, or the secondary branches coming from the trunk. That would be the picture matrix. And what I want to do to bring it even closer, I want to lift everything back here, getting this boundary closer to the top of the image, which means I could also lift this a bit higher through here, bringing things even closer together. And this is the nice thing about being able to identify the different parts of a picture through their simple nature, rather than looking at things complex, like every branch on a tree or all the crags of rocks in the mountains. We're looking at basic shapes, which makes things much easier to identify when something's out of place than if we were looking at things with more detail in mind. Lower this. So this is our graphic matrix. This is the shape language of the picture and the scale and orientation of those shapes to one another. Now, the next thing to do would be to bring in the quote-unquote local values. So local values are local colors, but because we're working on things in grayscale, we don't have to work on the color portion of it as of yet. We just need to identify the lightness and the darkness of each object in a grayscale sort of way. So what's important here now is that we look for the darkest to the lightest. In landscape painting, it is said to start from the background and work your way to the foreground. But since we're not really landscape painting, we're just learning something about the elements of a picture, we're not going to stick with that plan. What we're going to do is we're going to go from the darkest to the lightest. So the trees are not black. They're a dark value, somewhere down around in here. I'll use that dark value to fill in each of these spaces. And I'm not going to play with all the little holes in the tree as of right now. I'm just blocking in the larger masses in value so we can again see things graphically. The next value that's the next darkest is the tree line in the background along here. And I'm not cutting into it with all the little triangles. I'm just laying in the tree line so we can see it as a graphic shape. Then the darks of all the mountains. And we can see a contrast difference back here. So the first place to paint would be against the other shapes. As you can see, that's too dark. So I'm going to go lighter until there is enough contrast between the trees and what we can see in the background. Now the trees might need to go a little bit darker back in here. And by darkening those down, there's definitely a larger jump in the local values. I'm going to simplify all of these values along in here for now, all the way up to the top of this point. Yes, there are lighter patches in there, but that's not the goal that we're looking for. We're looking for the relationship of these values. And I'm going to speed this up by using the lasso tool and doing quick fills. The beauty of digital is the extra tools that we have available to us, like the lasso tool or the marquee tool, that allows us an instant graphic fill, where otherwise doing things by hand can take a long time. Off to the left and off to the right of the mountain, along the baselines here, that same dark region gets lighter along here in 2 steps. And over here in 2 steps. I'm going to take the value that we have currently, and I'm going to lighten it. And I'm looking at the 2 values here to make sure that what I'm seeing is effectively getting lighter. Visually, it might not appear that way right away, especially if there's a lot of white surrounding what we're looking at. The white that we have on the page is a problem with our eyes because our eyes have a tendency to go blind to what we're building when we have too much white in its surroundings, which is why you might hear, when you make a painting, it's a good idea to neutralize the picture space by giving it a gray background. That's to reduce the whiteness or the brightness from your eyes so that you don't have that snowblind feeling. Eventually, this entire space will be filled and we won't have that issue. A little bit lighter again. And one more time, we're not going to see it necessarily right away. Although if your eyes are good, you can see the difference between those 3 values. And what I mean by your eyes being good, the more you train, the easier subtlety is to find. But while you're learning, you might not see the subtlety right away. And that's okay because it's something that you're learning to build as an adaptation in your eyes. You're learning how to see, and it does take time to do that. There are darks over here that are even darker than the darks over here. I'm going to select this value first, darken it down a little bit, and use that. And then in the foreground, there's all the undercuts along here, but that's small shapes, and I'm not as concerned about those yet. Now we move on to the next lightest value, which would be the ground plane here, as well as the tree and the rock that's over off to the right, or the mountain that's off to the right. And I want to get rid of the dancing ants for right now so that I can see the change occur. And that's a pretty decent difference between the two, which may, back here, this may need to go darker. As of right now, though, I'm going to go ahead and leave the value range as it is and fill the rest of the space until there's enough coverage everywhere. And then I can make adjustments from that. These rocks are really close to the same value as this, but visually speaking, I'm going to increase the brightness by about a half a value to a full value. And that's for separation in the picture space. Eventually, you're going to learn something called grouping. Grouping is where you take a bunch of different colors that all share the same value and group them into one shape. For right now, though, for this learning exercise, we're going to keep things really simple and break things up into its different parts for the time being. Now, there's a gradation that's occurring in here, but I'm going to ignore it for now, and I'm going to work with just one big value. Since we're not in the gradation stage of the process yet, that comes later. Some of you might call it rendering, but it's actually gradating. That's what we do when we render. When I squint my eyes and look at the mountaintop and I look at the sky, they're practically the same value, but they're opposing colors. They're complementary colors to each other, which makes things very difficult to notice their relationship to each other. We see it more as a blue against an orange. Let's go to the grayscale image for a moment. Notice how the mountaintops practically disappear into the sky, especially the ones back here. Those do blend right into the sky. But up here, there is a distinction. There is a full value distinction between the two. So I still have room to go one more value brighter. One more value brighter. Looking over here, that's more like what we saw in the photograph, the difference between the sky and the mountain. And we need to get rid of the outlines. This will be sped up in video. In addition to getting rid of the outlines, we also need to get rid of the gaps. Anything that's in the picture that has a visual gap to it, where it separates the two objects by whiteness or by the outline, need to disappear in order for us to read the values correctly. They need to be running right into one another. Any spaces makes it very difficult for us to be able to judge what we're looking at. And this is not OCD talking here. This is actually being very faithful to your eyes so that you can see things objectively. Then we have the trunk of the tree, which is really close to the same value as the ground plane. We'll go ahead and start with it that way. Yes, there are little dark spots on it, and there's dark patches everywhere in here, but for right now, to keep things simple, this is what we're going to look at. Now, this is what you would call the local values. It takes time to learn how to see these local values. Don't expect this to just be an instant thing for you to be able to see. Color is very powerful. Color gets in the way of being able to see as a value. But assured, every color you look at, even fluorescents, have values to them. If you took a picture of something fluorescent and then turned it to grayscale, you would see the notable differences between each fluorescent color and the value that it portrays, or the value that it has built into it, against the other colors that are also value driven. There are no colors that don't have value. Color is value. It is one and the same. And I'm going to do one last thing here. I'm going to take the outer edges along here, up here, and over here, and build the white background back into it to get rid of any anomalies that might stand in our way of objectively looking. So this is the first layer. This is what you would call local value. Now, unfortunately, this picture has a really large gradation back here. So putting in the shadow value is not going to be an easy thing to do unless you can identify where the gradation terminates. In the case up here, it terminates somewhere right along here. Everything else up through here is a gradient. It goes from orange to red, red to purple, like on the color wheel. It passes through each color until it gets to the darkest color. Now, if we're talking about light, there's a difference in wavelength between each of the colors and not a lot of difference in value. But if we're talking about color, there's an impressionistic color wheel, which is what I've learned, and I'll be teaching you once we get to the color component of our painting process. But for the time being, we're going to stick literally with values to understand what we're looking at from object to object. And we're not going to think about the gradation through here as part of the transition to the shadows. We're going to look for the cutoff point of the shadows and identify that, which is right along in here. And it lifts a little bit only because of the elevation change of the mountain. It's actually something probably a little bit more like this. I'm going to use a multiply layer for this to separate it from the local values that we have. This entire mountain over here is also in shadow, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the same grouping with everything else. And then I'm going to remove the trees in the foreground from it and all the darker patches. This tree is in shadow, but we have more contrast against the tree in the foreground than we do against the mountain in the background. And then I'm going to find the shadow value, which, because we're multiplying this, that means whatever you take on top and lay it over the bottom, the two are multiplied together to give you a certain darkness. So what you would perceive as the shadow value has to be distorted and changed or lightened a little bit to achieve the correct kind of shadow value that you're seeing. I'm going to use this, but I'm going to lighten it up now with levels. Bring it up in value a little bit. And now that's the shadow value in the background, which means that this is too dark along in here. The trees come up to about right here. So what I'm going to do in the background is I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to join this with the light portion of the mountain for the time being. Now, yes, it is darker, but that's the transition and the gradation between the lit portion and the shadow portion. Now down in here, I'm going to use a brush and just quickly paint in the shadows. Otherwise, this would take a very long time to marquee trap all these different little areas. And I'm not going to take all of them and cover all of them, but I am going to do the major blocks that we see. There's a few bigger ones, and there's some patterns that are sort of moving through the floor over here. Parts of the tree. So those would be the shadow, or this whole foreground is in shadow, but those would be shadows within the shadows that we're looking at in the foreground. And there's a rule for that as well, but we'll talk about that later. For now, what we're learning how to do is block in a picture based upon 1, the local values, and then 2, the shadow values. The form of measure that we use here is a word called notan. Notan is the measure between dark and light, whether that dark and light is local values or the difference between the shadow value and the lit side of a form. Both of those are measured in the same way. We are looking for the graphic difference between the darkest value and the lightest value of each object when we're looking at shadows. When we're looking at local values, I'm going to turn the shadows off here. We blocked in each of these based upon the lightness and darkness against each other. And if we need to, we can bring back our grayscale photograph. And the one value that could be improved upon would be the local value of the mountains. So I'm going to go ahead and select that and then darken it slightly. Now this is closer to what the photo reference shows us. I think down here could also be darkened slightly. And we're even closer to what the photograph shows us. Now this mountain over here, because it's in shadow, is darkened when we apply the shadow layer to it. So that suffices for its darkness. The only thing that's left to make this picture work is the gradation between the shadow side and the light side of the forms. But we're not going to go there this time because we're really learning how to identify the differences between local values and how to apply the shadows to them as a graphic basic shape to start off with. The problem with jumping right into gradations is that we assume that the gradation is the shadow, but that's the transition of the form. That's how the forms turn in 3D space, whether they're planar or they're curvilinear. There's a gradient that moves across those surfaces, going from a pure state of color to a more washed out or a subdued state. Subdued being in the shadows, washed out from the lights. Or distance. If this was a flat plane that we were looking at, the foreground might be cleaner, clearer, and brighter, and as it goes back into space, it might diminish in value. And as it diminishes, it might lose value, it might increase value. It's all determined by all the different properties that are happening at the same time within that scene, that particular scene. But this is what we learn how to do as the next step in an art school. We learn to draw the shapes, then we learn to fill in the shapes. And the first place we go is the color of the object, which is called a local color or a local value if we grayscale it. Local value is the same thing as local color. And a color theory rule is color equals value equals color. Basically saying that regardless of the color that you see, it has a value to it. And you're learning to identify that so that you can get the value structure correct of the colors you're looking at. If an orange is darker, it won't be as vibrant as the orange we see in this photograph. it will start to take on something more like this ruddy color or a greenish hue because it's darkening in value depending upon its temperature and the temperature of the light source that's affecting it. Both of those come into play and alter the surface. Yellow does the same thing. Yellow either starts to turn more orangey as it gets darker or more greenish as it gets darker. And every other color does the same thing. And that orange against green in its change is temperature related. As it gets greener, it's a cooler temperature influence. As it gets more orangey, it's a warmer temperature influence. But this again is for another conversation later on when we start talking about color. So as a first round exercise, you would want to take a bunch of photographs that you have and flatten them out into local values. Turn your photo reference into grayscale after you do the local values and compare notes to each other. Once you start getting them close, then introduce the shadow values. Now there is one thing I want to do here. I'd like to take the local value of this foreground mountain and darken it down just a little bit more because it does have an even darker value to it. Somewhere right around here. Which means then that these will get darker. Which means that even these will get darker. And now we have a good quality image of local values. And then in addition to this, we have that same image with shadow patterns sitting on top of it. Now the next image I'm going to do is going to be better illuminated with clear shadows on each object, because this one was a bit ambiguous with the larger gradation in the background because of the sunset that's taking place. We're not getting that clear definition of the difference between a lit object and its shadow side. So the next reference that we look at will cover that. In the meantime, though, find a folder full of images and start practicing this first stage, which is to break things down into their local values. And then to check and balance whether or not you're going in the right direction, convert your reference to grayscale. But don't use it as the starting point. Use it as a backup and try to identify these local values using your eyes first. Yes, it helps to have whatever training wheels we can have, but in order for you to start practicing something, you're learning to train your eyes to see. And if you use those training wheels for everything, then you have too many handicaps, too many other tools that you're going to need to use whenever you try to solve a problem. And the ultimate goal is to train your eyes to see things properly so that you can do it right then and there using the objects. And, if you were drawing from life, there are ways of being able to convert what you see in front of you into grayscale, but again, that's an extra tool that you need to carry around with you, and you should be able to just look at things, identify them, and convert them to grayscale on your own without the need of those tools. So this is step one. In this next example, we have a still life. Still life images, I think, are the better type of image to work with first, even more so than a landscape, because with a landscape, you might have cloud cover in some places, causing the area that the cloud sits over to have no shadows, where next to that, in a sunlit spot, everything could have bright lighting on it with strong shadows. So it just becomes a more convoluted space or a more complex space to study from first. And a still life object or objects are usually simple, and you can put colors next to each other of various types. And each color has its own value. Like the yellow of this lemon is different than the orange of this, I guess it's a tomato, possibly. And there's a value distinction between them, just like these two oranges, the orange of the cantaloupe and the orange of this fruit or vegetable, is different. This one is darker orange. This one is lighter orange. So those would also have different values to them. Now, what makes this image stand out so well over the previous image that we were looking at is that each has a strong shadow on it coming from a direct light source. We look for that direct light source by looking at the ground plane and looking for the shadows being cast by the objects. Those shadows that are being cast tell us the strength of the light, how dark they are versus how light they are, and the direction the light is coming from. In this case, we have a strong spotlight, likely a spotlight because they have really darkened shadows where the value is much lower than more atmospheric, which would be a slightly weaker light, allowing the ambience of the room to fill in the shadows, which is usually what happens. The indirect light is almost as strong as the direct light, and it distorts the shadow values. We have strong highlights on each of these objects as well, so that does show that the light source is fairly powerful. If we were to look at this in grayscale, as I was saying before, we have a difference in value between these two objects as well as these two objects, as well as these two objects, and so forth. We can see the lightness and the darkness of each of the colors next to each other. So there is a difference in almost all of these objects. These two objects are the lightest, then these, then this, then the background, then the rind and the avocado. Somewhere in there I needed to include this. The floor plane would be included with these values. So those will be grouped together as one, although I might shift the ground a little bit so that they don't disappear completely for the time being. I'll prioritize the ground as lighter than these objects so that they stand out a little bit more, or I might make it darker since back here is darker and over here is darker. This is the gradation across a surface. It's brighter closest to us because the light source is just over our shoulder. And as the light goes back into space, it also drops in its strength. And that's why we're seeing the background darker. The same thing across the backdrop here. It's lighter over here and it's darker over here. In fact, we can sort of see it in a conical sort of way. We can see it circular through here. It's lighter through this space, but it's darker in both of these corners. And that shows the shape of the light source, the roundness of it, as do highlights. They will also show the shape of the light source at times. Unless they're muted highlights, you should be able to sort of see either a circularness or a squareness. A squareness would be a box light or a window that has light shining through it, where the circular light will be your sun, your spotlight, a single light source, a bulb of sorts. All right, so the first thing we want to do then, again in a hierarchy, is go from dark to light. Our avocado. Actually, what I'm going to do here, because I want to preserve the composition space, I'm going to take the floor plane value, or actually I'll take the background wall value. And I'll use that first over the entire image. Then I'm going to layer lock this layer. I'm in Photoshop, so I can layer lock this, which means now anything I paint will remain within this shape. It will not break the shape. So I can then take my marquee tool again like so and find the floor value and fill it. And now we have the big picture space ready for all the fruits to be placed on top. Now, I know this is going out of the orderliness that I was mentioning earlier, but again, I want to preserve this boundary line. Since I'm not drawing an outline around it, this is sort of my outline. And we've solved two big problems. So anything else we place on top of these will either be lighter or darker than these values. And that makes it a little bit easier for us to manage all the other values, especially since they're all so close to one another in value, minus the two in the middle. So the avocado breaks the horizon line, or our table line, somewhere right around in here. And so does the skin of the cantaloupe, which I'm going to have to break up into little pieces here. Got to be careful not to draw too slowly, or Photoshop sabotages what I'm doing by its Command-Shift prompt that I have turned off once before, but doesn't turn off for some reason. Now, parts of this avocado are turning in space, so they're getting darker, and part of it is in shadow, and I have to be very mindful of what value to choose because there's a whole variety of them. So when I squint my eyes, all the values sort of blend together and become an average value minus the highlight that sits right in the middle. And in that average value, I can sort of assume which one to use. The skin of the cantaloupe is lighter. I'm going to take the avocado out of the selection, and I'm going to lighten the cantaloupe skin by just a tiny bit. So those are the first two values to start off with. Then the next darkest would be this shape over here. And it is at least 2 full values lighter than what I've just used, and is also lighter than the background. Now with the value selected, I'm going to lighten it just a little bit more than the background value to better approximate its value range. Next would be this object over here and this one over here. Well, no, actually, probably this one, then those two with the inside of this. So this one next. I'm doing the squint test now to double check both. Now the inside of this minus all the seeds. But for now, I'm just going to group all of them together. This is a little bit lighter. And I'm going to use that same value for this shape. This part is lighter up here, but I'm going to go ahead and group it all together anyway. And then this shape over here. And what I'm doing there is I'm flashing above the canvas the other shape to approximate where it would sit. And then that gives me an idea of where to place the next shape. This is broken up into 2 local values. There's the body of it, and then there's the cone portion up here. And that is about a 1/4 value darker. Then we'll move on to the shape here. And I'm going to go another 1/4 value lighter. And then finally the shape that's over here, which I'm going to go another 1/4 lighter. And that same value I'm going to use for the 3 seeds that sit in here. I'll make a few adjustments. And I'm also going to lighten this value. And I'm also going to change the value right here of the plug. Make that a 1/4 value darker. And then there's a little tiny light spot right in the middle of it. Maybe not as light. Go a little tiny bit darker with that. And then there's also a small dark plug right here. A lot darker than it should be just because it's also sitting in shadow, which once we place the shadow on top of it will end up darker. And I'm going to add the extensions onto this. There's also the leaf that sits up here. Part of that leaf is in shadow. The rest of it is lit. And it looks roughly the same value as the actual object. Clean this up just a touch. And now we're ready to apply the shadows. But first, let's just evaluate. There's also a little thin strip of light along here. When something is missing from your composition, it's very easy to spot. It's actually too light. I'm going to go a little darker with it. That looks like I made it almost the same value as the rest of the fruit. That's pretty close. It's a little bit lighter up towards the top, but I think that'll do. But like I said earlier, when you're looking at these objects, like this one as an example, it's really easy to see when something's missing or something is off. And it does look like it's off a little bit because it doesn't have the same lightness as it appears in the photograph. Now, here's something to keep in mind. When you're looking at an object, especially a rounded object, keep looking and referring to the same spot on that object, because as soon as you move your eyes, say from up here to here, the value changes. And from here to here, the value changes. And from here to here, the value changes. It shifts. And so when you're looking at a rounded object, the best thing to do is to squint at the object to keep the whole thing as uniform as possible while you're making your visual decisions. Once you know you've identified and changed things, then open your vision back up. Look at everything related to each other. Compare that to your reference and how close are you. And that's a good rule to keep in mind when you're picking and deciding. As I'm sitting here looking at this, I realize that the background could also be a little bit darker. It's just one of those things you'll start to notice because I was looking in the big light area here and not overall. I was assuming a certain value range, but once I squint my eyes and I let the whole thing become one uniform value, it definitely feels like it's off in my reference, where now I'm a little bit closer in accuracy to what it is. So this is looking at all the local values and measuring them through NOTAN. Which one is darker? Which one is lighter? How do we control the lightness and the darkness of each of those in relationship to the others until we have something that's fairly close and accurate? Now remember that accuracy is what you're aiming for in your exercises, because it's just going to make you that much stronger at what you do when it's time, when it counts in your illustration work and your artwork that you really want to make that's meaningful to you. That's when you put it to use, where all these exercises are helping you approximate what you're looking at and getting your eyes in tune so that they capture things correctly in their lightness and their darkness. The next thing we want to do is place shadows. The first and most important shadow, again, is the ground shadow. So everywhere that there's a ground shadow, I'm going to go ahead and block those in. And I'm not looking for the shadows on the objects yet, or the cast shadows, the form shadows or the cast shadows on the objects. I'm just looking for the cast shadows on the ground plane. The ground is the same value regardless of which object is casting a shadow. The shadows are all going to be the same projection darkness. Now that isn't as dark as they should be, but once I change this to a multiply layer, you'll see they go really dark. That might be too dark. I'm going to go ahead and lighten the layer a little bit, or the value of this in the layer. And now that's a little bit closer to what they should be. Now, like I said, all of the projected shadows are going to be the same value because they're on the ground plane. But the shadow value of each object is going to change depending upon its lightness and darkness. The lighter an object gets, the lighter the shadow will appear on it. In addition, we have some shiny objects in here, right here and right here, and those have what are called reflected light in them. Reflected light is coming from the ground and is bouncing up into the shadows, illuminating them so they don't appear as strong in those particular spots. We want to ignore that for the time being, and we want to give it an average value. That reflected light is part of the gradation stage. Once we get involved in the gradation stage, we make adjustments to things through the use of gradation, and you can see the gradient falling off right along in here, up here, and down in here. There's a gradation to those areas. Just like there's a gradation surrounding each of these cast shadows, because the light source is a broad light source, meaning that it's not a single small bulb. it's a larger box of lights. So there's multiple lights, which is causing the shadows to diffuse. That's why you would use a light box to illuminate something, is to reduce the harshness of the shadow patterns. That's a technical thing that we can talk about in another discussion. But for right now, I'm pointing out something technical for us so that we don't go too far ahead of ourselves while we're solving these problems. I'll start with the darkest objects. So there's a shadow here and over here on the cantaloupe. And then there's a little sliver of light right here. Darker object, darker shadow. But remember, this is a multiply layer, so we also have to lighten that shadow by a little bit in order for the multiply to be correct. So now I've made an adjustment to the value. Moving on to the next darkest object, we have the avocado. And its shadow along here, which is also going to be too dark for the same reasons. It's a multiply layer. But what I know I'm doing is I'm selecting what I think is the right value for the shadow. And then I'm making technical adjustments based upon the multiplication of the value on top of a value within the program. If we were to do this in Paint, I would pick the exact value and paint it down exactly the way we see it, which next time I can use a normal layer to put the shadows on top of. It's just in the painting process that I use digitally, shadows are added through multiply layer, lights or brightness, highlights, and so forth are added on an overlay layer. And that helps blend the colors correctly based upon addition or subtraction of the local value. Something I'll get into when I start describing digital painting in the future. Next darkest object, over here. Small shadow on its far side, and the cast shadow from the turnip shape. Picking a lighter value on a lighter object, but even that needs to be lightened up a little bit because of the multiply situation. Then this object, cast shadow and form shadow. In addition, the little leaf shadows up on the top. Going to go just a little bit lighter here, project the shadow, lighten it up just a tiny bit because of the multiply. Then this object over here and this one over here. They're close to the same value. Actually, this part up here is probably closer to this value here than this part. So I'll wait on this. Go a little bit lighter in my pick, then go a little lighter because of the multiply. Now the body and the body on this object, and inside the shadows along here and over here. Go a little lighter here, fill the shadow spaces, lighten them up a little bit, then move on to the lightest object. Cast shadow is a little bit darker here than the form shadow, which we can make adjustments to later. And then the little light spot right here, pull that out, lighten this up a little bit more, and project the shadow, which is too light in this case. Like I said, the cast shadow is going to be a little bit different in this case. It's a really dark cast shadow against its form shadow side. So what I'll do is I'll take this out of the selection and I'll darken this one. Now overall, looking at all of the light objects, I feel like I can probably darken their shadows just a little bit more. I went a little too far with lightening them up. And then this one up here, I forgot to darken. But this is easy to identify because we have all of them on the page at the same time. If we were just working with one object at a time, we might not see this. But it's good because we have the whole composition here. And there's no distortions because no gradations have been added. Now, why does each shadow get lighter on each object? A lighter surface is going to have a lighter local value to it. Regardless of how strong the light source is, darker objects absorb more light, lighter objects reflect more light. So the shadows will appear lighter as the objects get lighter. Although they are illuminated by the same light source, the surface causes changes. As long as we keep the difference between the lit side and the shaded side similar on each of these objects, they will all look like they're illuminated by the same light source. If I was to take all these objects and do this with them, just put a black shadow on everything, graphically speaking, we could get away with this, but scientifically and literally, this is not how light works. The shadows are going to change in their intensity based upon the lightness, the darkness, as well as the shininess or the matteness, dull or shininess of each object. The duller an object gets, the more the shadow is pronounced. The more reflective an object gets, the harder a shadow is to see on the object. So it starts to feel more atmospheric rather than dark and stark, like the more matte objects will. In the scene here, this object and this object are the least shiny. So those will have more of a true value range on them, where all the other objects have a little bit of shininess, so they have reflectivity in them, which is causing the shadows not to feel the same intensity as the matte objects. The inside of this will also have a more true shadow to it. It's wet on the inside, but it's turned away from the light source, so it's not reflecting as much light back. Therefore, the shadows will look more true to the light source than on all these other objects that have a shininess to them. The floor is the same way, and so is the wall. They don't have a reflection to them, so they're going to show the true nature of the light source, which that is a good thing because it makes it easier for us to identify how strong the light source is, and that allows us that slider space when we work with the variables on all these other objects. Having them more shiny makes the shadow more difficult to work with, but knowing what our light source is doing by its strength, power, and direction, we have a starting point for every object regardless of their reflectivity or their absorption of light. So the only thing left to do with this now is to build the gradations from the shadow to the light side, the gradations of the forms as they're turning in space, moving away from the light source, which will highlight the brightest area of each object, taking us to the last step, which is to apply accents and highlights and ambient light to the objects through gradations. Those are more incidental, so we keep those out of the equation until the very end. Until then, we work with local values first, shadow patterns second. Then all those other steps come afterwards. So as I said, still lifes are a little bit easier for us to understand this concept, and I hope that this is making more sense now that we have worked with this second example.
If this information is doing it for you and you're getting something from it, please consider liking the video, subscribe to my channel, possibly become a member of the channel, or maybe support me over on Patreon. The membership side has a lot of lessons and additional videos that you're not going to find on the regular channel. As well, I will be meeting with everyone at least once a month, if not more, if the membership goes up, so that I can also work with all of you to critique your work and give you additional feedback like in a classroom. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate all of your support. Now let's get back to the content.
Now, for the figure no-tans, the thing you have to kind of keep in mind is if there's a suntan on the body, kind of ignore it. Squint your eyes and look through at the average value all over. We want the background, the floor, the body, the hair, the headband, and the bikini shapes. All of those are a part of the no-tan process. The first place that I always go to is the background. However, I want to do one thing first. I want to block in where the hair shape is on the head. The hairline up here, coming down to the side, down around the ear, bring it back to the back of the skull, up and over the skull. Remember to make it taller than the skull because hair sticks up off of the head. The head wrap that goes up and over, behind the ear, the hair tie, and the ponytail. It looks like it ends somewhere right around in here. Then I also want to put on the bikini lines. Cross here, on here, down through the middle, up and over to the other shoulder. Through the finger mass, around the hip, front. This can actually be lower here, up and over the hip, and to the back. This could still be tilted even further through here, around the body, over the hip, and then something that represents the floor and the back, and the stage as it comes forward towards us. The stage goes off camera over here, and then the cloth that's on the floor, somewhere along there and there. And this goes off the edge over here. There's a small hint of the floor over here, but I'm going to put up the boundary lines. I'm going to lower this to fit the page, and I'm going to bring this over to here instead of way over to the other side of the photograph. So that's the zone to paint within. The distance between here and here is a little bit much as well. I'm going to drop this down a little bit lower, drop the breast line a little lower. And my figure overall is a little bit taller than she is, and I'm going to be okay with that. All right, so the first space that I want to fill is the background. Background value is not pure black, somewhere right around here in value. Get out a multiply layer so that the line drawing stays visible for now. Looks like in parts it's this dark, especially up around the head, but the rest of it having reflected light on it goes a little lighter, but that's reflected light. So I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to pay attention to right over here and up here, which gives me an overall average of what I'm looking for. The stage is lighter than the background, but darker than the white drop cloth. Then this little hint of floor over here is probably the same value, even though it's a different color. Somewhere around that value. Then the cloth. Somewhere around that value. Now her skin is about as light as that cloth. I'm going to make it just a tiny bit lighter. And with this now, I'm going to be very careful about how I map this line. And I'll be able to add and subtract to it later. This is the part that's kind of under my hand, so I can't see it as easily. All right, so now I want to take this value here, which is already selected, and I'm going to go about a quarter to a half value lighter. Oops, forgot to knock out this part here. And there's a hint over here at the elbow that's taken out, and then between here. I'm going to take the line art from the muscular portion, the écorché portion, take that and lighten it up. I'm going to lighten the skeleton more, and I'm going to lighten the armature more, just so the values are just a little bit more visible to our eye. All right, so now that that's blocked in, I want to clean it up a little bit. Over here, I'm going to put back the background value. And up here, this is a little too overdone. This over here doesn't have enough of the tendon involved in the muscle block in. Over here, the muscle's a little too exposed or a little overdone. The chin needs to be blocked out further. Find a clean area where I can grab the figure value. And the ankle's too large down in here. In fact, both of them are. This is going to be tricky. Grab the cloth, then the stage, then the background. And on this side, I'll do the same thing. Right along here, the stage, the backdrop, the drop cloth. Maybe a little overdone along here. Put in the background value through there. Trim down the muscles just a little bit. And over here I can bring the muscles down a little bit further. So now that's reorganizing and redefining some of the masses. Now the one thing that I'll make note of is that this foot is dropped down too far. It's not in perspective the way that it should be. So that is an error. And that's a big error that I'm not going to be able to fix necessarily. But at this point, it's not about the anatomy as much as it is about just teaching what the no-tan language is. Now, up in the hair, it's roughly the same value as the background, but I'm going to go one value lighter, just so it remains a little more visible against the backdrop. Then the headband, I'm going to go a little bit lighter with that, although they are close to the same value. Then darker for the bikini. Cut out the finger over here, and then cut out the fingers over here. Raise this line up just a little bit higher through here, and then find its local values. That's the major local value no-tan grouping. There's also one more back over here. I made this up a little bit higher than it should be. I'm going to give it the same value as the skin tone. That whole shape could be just a little bit lower, but it works. It suffices. Now this is a really good figure drawing reference for the lighting because there's only one light source. The reflected light that's in this shot is coming from the drop cloth, not from a second light, which is really nice because it's difficult to find good reference online. It just doesn't really exist. Everybody who shoots photos for the sake of art does dual lighting, and dual lighting is not the kind of lighting that we're looking for when we're first studying the human form. We're trying to find a singular light source, and that is much more difficult to find. Recently, I have found a few images that I can use for that, this included, but it is very difficult to find a uniform single light source to work from. New layer for the shadows. Set it to multiply. And the reason for setting it to multiply is so it connects together with the local values already there, and it still shows us our drawing all the way through for the time being. Now, we use the anatomy for this. So I'll start over here with going around the latissimus, along the pectoralis, up through the bicep, down the arm, into the rotation muscles, the supination muscles, over the supination muscles, down along the supination muscles, across the top of the arm along the extensors, and then turn at the wrist. And then finish that off, come through here, trim down where I know that I've gone too excessive with it. Kind of a back and forth. Then looking at the values, I'd say that the contrast between the light source and the shadow is around 4 values. So our local value here, we go 1, 2, 3, 4 values, and that's going to be roughly what we need for the shadow pattern. Now it takes some getting used to figuring out how to go incremental on the value scale in a digital program because they don't lay it out the same way we need to as an artist. We design our own value scales. If you've ever been in a class where you had to draw one, then you know what I'm talking about. The underside of the hand, the front of the pinky finger, the knuckle of the ring finger, the knuckle of the middle finger across the top portion of it, and then on the underside of the index finger. Now to the front of the face. I'm going to start generic. I'm going to go straight up through the skull and block in half of the face. Then the inside of this eye socket. Then I'm going to cut the nose away from it. Then I'm going to add the laugh line to it. And I'm going to turn this over the muzzle, so cut that portion away. Cut this portion away. And I have too much of the skull over here, but I'm going to go ahead and cover that up for now. Eventually I'll cover it up with a background. Now, along the throat, through the sternocleidomastoideus muscle, along the clavicle, into the sternum, down the sternum, over the breast shape, under the breast, down through the abdominal wall, around the corner of this ab. Oops, I went the wrong way. Over this ab, down along the pubis, up into the thigh, along the sartorius, up and over the quadricep, into the kneecap, down the patellar tendon, around the tendon, along the shin bone, into the ankle, then back up the form. Cast shadow on the far thigh, down along the quadricep, tendon of the quadricep, over the patella, down the patellar tendon, along the tibialis anterior, around the calf muscle group, down over the ankle, into the arch of the foot, over the toes, then back up the other side of the figure. And everything on this side is in shadow. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill all of this in at once, and then I'm going to take the bikini shadows and darken them even further. Because they're on a darker surface, they would be darker. Between the big toe and the second toe, the same over here. Lock all of that in at once. Then take the bikini shadow. Use levels to darken it down another value. Do the same thing with this along here. Using levels again, dropping the value so there's more contrast. Now, it's hard to see the contrast, but there's little folds right along here that splinter this way. There's 2 of them. And go a little darker with that. And then the one shadow that really counts the most, which I did not put in first, and I actually should have, is the cast shadow on the floor plane. Out along here, I'm going to ignore the folds in the drop cloth. Around the big toe, connecting back up with this shadow. Since her skin and the drop cloth are roughly the same value, I'm going to keep it the same value for the floor. And then there's one more shadow up here on the shoulder, over the deltoid, into the acromion process, around the clavicle, into the pectoralis, and back down. There's a shadow over here being cast by the fingers. And that'll do it for the shadow patterns. There's also the bikini value back here that I forgot to put in on the previous layer. Grab the local value again for that. And then when I take all the lines of the line drawing and shut those off, there's your local values. Now this one right up along in here I want to remove because it's additional noise that doesn't need to be there. That's on the shadow layer. Now after this stage, we would go into the gradation stage, which we won't be doing here because in this particular demo, it's just about plotting the notans for both the local values as well as the light and shadow values. There's also one more shadow along the underside here. And that one I'm also going to go a little darker with using levels so it's a bit more visible. And that's how you do the first stage of a painting. And the second stage of a painting, you find the local values, then you find the shadow values, and you make the clear distinction along the shadow line. where the shadow is supposed to go. And once that's blocked in, the only thing we have left to do is the gradation stage, which will turn the form. Oh, there's also the shadow in the hair up here and across the headband and back along in here. Now we can turn the form along the top of the skull. Now this is a little bit much back here. That could be slimmed down a little bit more, but I think you get the idea, especially for just a 20-minute demo. There would be much more refinement if I was doing this for myself. I would be spending more time overall on it, cleaning things up and refining things as I go. But because I don't want to spend a lot of time on the demonstration, taking up too much of your time, I'm moving through this a little bit quicker, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what it is that we're supposed to be doing. All right, on to the next figure. Now with this second demonstration, the background is light, but remember that light doesn't necessarily mean white. It just means lighter. I'm going to block in all of it at once. The ground is really close to the same as the wall. Grab a value that's close and then block it all in. So that's the preliminary value. And it looks like it might be a little on the dark side. I'm going to lighten it up just a tiny bit. Somewhere close to there. Then I'm going to block in the entire figure, including the hair, as one value to start off with, and then I'll adjust for the hair and the shorts. Start on the side that usually my hand covers since I'm left-handed. And I'll fix the lines that move beyond the block in just a moment here. So go back around and make adjustments to these. I saw somewhere down here. There it is. And I thought, yeah, right over here. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so now his skin tone has reflectivity to it in the chest. But if I squint down and look at the skin, looking at a value somewhere right around here. Look for any places where I might have missed. Then I'm going to go back in, start with this shape. And using levels, I'm going to make an adjustment to it. Somewhere right around there. And then for the beard and the mustache, I'll do the same thing. A little bit of mustache that's under here. And then take levels and make an adjustment for that. Okay, now for the shadow notans. I'm going to start with the floor plane shadow. And because I have a value, actually this is on a separate layer, never mind. This is up elevated too high as well. I'm going to bring this down a little. Go just another half a value lighter to a full value lighter. Something a little more like that. So he has a diffused light. The cast shadows by his feet, because their contact point to the floor, are going to be sharper, but then as they move away, they quickly blur, which means he has one of those big box lights on him. And that's going to be a lot lighter and a lot softer. The edge of the shadow patterns on him aren't going to be as harsh, but we still want to block them in with a clearly defined cutoff point so that we can add that gradation later. I'm going to block this in sections. If you notice, all the shadows that I'm blocking are convex in their shape language. I'm not building any concaves because we don't have any on our body. This is something I'll talk about again later when we get to the rendering stage of the picture making process. And he also has a cast shadow from his arm onto his torso, around the kneecap, behind his ankle and below his foot, the side of his foot, and between each toe set. All right, so I'm going to go a little bit darker with this shadow pattern than on the floor plane, since the floor is light and his skin is darker. And then any place else that I might have missed or made excessively small. Connect the shadow patterns together back here. All right, now for the hair and the shorts. Let's start with the shorts. Going a little bit darker with those. And then the hair. Now with the hair, it may not be visible to the eye right away, but the more you work with dark objects, especially light absorption objects like hair does, it absorbs light, you'll start to notice the shadow patterns. His is right along here. It's over here along the side plane of his head. And then most of his beard is in shadow. But that is basically the shadow pattern for him. Now again, I blocked everything in convexly because our body doesn't have any concavities in it. Everything is going to be convex. And that is about it. So this is another no-tan pattern. I didn't block in all of this in here because some of these are halftones. Those are halftones right there. Those aren't shadow. This is a shadow right here, but this is a halftone. I'm not going to fill in something that isn't a shadow. And that does take a while to learn how to see. Again, it's one of those things where you have to learn to see it in order to know what you're doing with it. There's a few more little shadows here that I want to block in. Here, along here. I also want to cut this away here, back here, and right along in here. All right, I hope this is making sense now, how you begin a painting. It's important that you understand where the shadows lie. If you can't see the shadows, sometimes halftones look like shadows, and it takes time to learn how to separate the two from one another. But if you can't see a shadow, then you won't understand how to describe the light, and the picture will become muddy because everything is either too light all over or too dark all over. One more spot right here. And now I think we're good. All right, I hope this is starting to make sense now. So this is an invented pose. We don't have a reference. We don't have a reference, but we still have forms to work with. Sorry, when it comes to invention, all of a sudden I go silent because I have to think about this a little bit. Kind of doing something in the vein of a project I'm working on right now, which I can't talk about. So I'm just basically thinking about the armature and the design of the shapes in that armature. Thinking about the flexion lines, because that's going to help create a more dynamic flow. I'm thinking about overlap and the dynamic of the overlap. And I'm thinking about the balance, how the hips and the shoulders react to one another, the overlap of the forms in 3D space, and how all of these will sit with each other. Heel's a little too far back. Now I'll do an entire video on invention at a certain point. But the goal here is just to show that drawing a picture, you don't need reference to see the forms, to see the lighting and so forth. You just need to have an idea. And then, of course, some knowledge in how to draw. And depending upon the subject matter, like the figure, some figurative knowledge. Doesn't need to be perfect though. And in fact, you shouldn't have to wait until you know that you have the right information to work with. You should be doing your own work, your own invention work, all along the way while you're learning. Don't wait for a certain point to draw your own work. Start right away. And beyond this masterclass, I'll show you some more advanced versions of the armature as well. But I want to stick with the basic shapes for now. I don't want to jump so far ahead that all of a sudden it's a completely different dynamic that we're working with. Making sure to really push those flexion lines. All right, so now that I have the block in, I'm going to embellish a few muscle rhythms, but I'm not going to get caught up in those. Because again, this isn't about demonstrating an invention of design through the figurative forms. This is more about no-tan, light and shadow, and being able to envision your idea, not just in line, but in light. All right, so I have just a few more shapes to build in here. And then we'll think about which direction the lighting is coming from. Okay. Move that spine over just a little bit more. All right, well, there is the invented pose. Now, the lighting is going to come from this direction. Thinking about it in 3D, putting my arrow in 3D so I know exactly which direction the light is coming from. So right 3/4 view. Or stage left. Do the usual on blocking the background first. Then I'm going to block out the figure. And because I'm not going to give away what this is in reference to, I'm just going to do a nude figure here in terms of local value. If I put the costume on it, then you'll know exactly what I'm working on. Whoa, that got away from me. All right, so now where is it off? Over here. Over here. Trim that away. Everything else is pretty close. All right. So I'm going to go a little bit lighter just to help pop the figure off of the background so the figure stands out more. And I could lower my background just a little bit. But my suspicion is he's a lot further off of the ground plane than just this. But we'll just say he's not too far away from it. His shadow pattern is going to be down in here somewhere. Out of the frame. Go ahead and block that out. So that gives me some point of reference for which direction and how strong the light source is. His leg would be kind of in front of that, wouldn't it? Kind of combine those shadows there. All right, now into the figure. The figure is lighter than the ground, so I'm going to use a slightly lighter shadow. That might be a little bit lighter than I want it. Let's go ahead and go darker. The neck is probably a little bit narrower than it should be. I'm just going through the protocol now of all the different areas. His arm is going to be casting a shadow onto his body, probably right around in here. So you can see I'm kind of piecing it together, area by area. I'm going to get the majority of the shapes in, and then I'm going to make some changes to a few of the shapes. That leg is going to be in shadow down along here, casting a shadow onto the foot, under the ankle, under the arch, under the leg over here. In fact, that whole entire foot will probably be in shadow because it's behind the entire torso. That needs a little fixing. This part of his thumb will be in shadow. This part of his index finger will be in shadow. This part of the finger will be in shadow. His shoulder. His head would be casting a shadow onto the back of him. The underside of his arm. Inside the palm of the hand. Along these fingers. This part of his wrist. And now I'll go back through and do some cleanup here. This part of him needs to be cut away. Add a little more shadow here. This is also going to be slimmed down just a little bit more, but it'll be extended up along the spine. And then this part of his back underneath the scapula. And I have a suspicion more of his foot would be in shadow here. This looks a little too contrived. Actually, this whole side of his foot would be in shadow. I'm looking at my light source again, realizing that the light source is coming from this way. This part of his calf muscle might be in light. I'm going to go ahead and bring that forward a little bit more. The underside of his muzzle and the underside of his chin. It's coming down this way. Yeah, that will be visible here on his hand, but the palm would probably be in shadow. This side of the eye socket. That arm will be completely in light, that hand in light. There might be a hint of a shadow here, but I don't think so. Gotta test it first just to see. Over the oblique, into the gluteus. Okay, so right along here I can get rid of that. This is the great trochanter here. The oblique, gluteus medius to gluteus maximus break, through the great trochanter, then into the quadricep. Maybe the underside of the rectus femoris along in here. That breaks the flow. Try this. It's a little better, but even that might be just a little too obnoxious. The vastus medialis along the sartorius, cast shadow of the arm. side plane of his torso, along the latissimus. So this might back up a little bit here. That entire foot in shadow, almost this entire foot in shadow. And then maybe a little bit more of this wrist would be in shadow. Trim a bit away from up here. The underside of his scapula. Along the upper arch of the trapezius muscle. And that means, because of the way this is, that this leg is going to be out farther here. Or rather, this is going to go back farther through here. And this needs to move back to here for it to cross over the body correctly. Something a little bit more like that. And then this would probably trail off of the back even further. So now, when the gradations go in, that will tell me more about the forms. But in the meantime, I can use this now to design the picture. If there's anything that's really troublesome in here, it'll get removed, regardless of whether it works or it's supposed to work or not. Because it's about the design now. When you're building an illustration, you are designing. I want to join this into this bigger rhythm so that everything flows more through here. Get that to help the eye flow through. Maybe curve this just a little bit more to help that eye flow. Get this to go over the leg a little further for that eye flow. Back along here, maybe it looks a little bit too crunchy. Maybe get rid of that. Get these to connect visually. Get this to flow through here with these. Cast shadow along this side of the spine, which now makes things flow better up through here. This arm over here isn't flowing very well. I want to get rid of this corner here. It's going to make the arm look a little more rubbery than it should. Maybe extend the flexor group out a little bit and then pinch this slightly through here. Now I'm using my knowledge of anatomy, mine with the different local value notans, to generate an image out of the imagination. What I do want is to lower this in the picture space so he's jumping higher off of the ground plane. Further down, I take it, the higher up he is off of the ground. Remove that so it stays within the picture plane. And now we have something a little bit more dynamic. I wanted to include this with the demonstrations because I want you to see that it's not just about pictorial reference and copying it. Eventually, you should be able to do this out of your imagination. Now, I don't know if all these shadow patterns are exactly correct. It will take rendering the form all the way through to see what works and what doesn't work. But I am thinking about the direction that this light source is coming from, the musculature within the figure, and how all of that combined together generates the shadow patterns that are needed to make this feel believable. I hope these have helped you realize what you are capable of doing and which tools you would use to help build a picture experience. Once you understand how to construct the figure, you understand the masses, the volumes. In cross-section, it makes it a lot easier for you to understand where a shadow will fall based upon the undulations of muscles and the direction that the light source is coming from, influencing those forms. And then organizing your local values so that you have pictorial focus. We have a light figure on a darker background, so the entire figure pose is focused. And if I need it to be focused even further, I could lighten the values in his head or darken the shadows in his head so that we have a place to look, a target location to look. I'd also do the same thing with the hand, so that the action of the hand and the expression of the face are the first place we go. And then we see everything else in tandem or in concert with that, all of it together, working together to form a movement, an action, and a flow. I want to make this flow just a little bit more this way with the rest of the leg. So the eye goes like this and doesn't get caught up in little ramps and bumps and that sort of thing. What we're looking for is a nice stream and flow to the head in every direction, so that becomes the focus of the moment. And the shadow pattern on the ground should also have a little bit of flow to it too. I know I threw this hand in there in haste. Now he has a flipper. A little more flow to that. A little more flow through here. And there you have it. The no-tan stage. Again, the only thing left to do is turn the forms with gradation. And that's the rest of the rendering process, which you'll see in the next video.
We're almost finished with this series. We have one more video lesson to cover, and that's gradation. So I hope this information was helpful for you to understand how to measure light and shadows. A lot of this information gets obscured into people's techniques, and that's why this video series is so important. It separates it out as a science rather than as a technique. This applies to anything. It applies to every kind of subject matter that uses light and shadow. That's what makes this a bit more unique. In the next episode, we're going to render form. Rendering form is gradation. Gradation is the name of what you do when you turn form. So we're keeping it specific to that name. But it really does mean render and render to a finish. All the different levels of rendering, whether it's on the light side, the shadow side, finding the occlusions, the highlights, the accents, whatever it is, there's still gradation involved in doing that. Thank you again for watching the video. Thank you for watching all of these videos and supporting the channel. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy the studies, stay creative, and I'll see you soon. Thank you again.